start our next presentation, which will be done by Kirsten DeMelo. A little information about Kirsten. She was born and raised in the USA, and she is a second-generation Spiritist, an active board member of the Spiritist Society of Baltimore. She coordinates meetings and gives talks on various Spiritist subjects. She is an active collaborator with the Spiritist movement in the USA, and professionally, she is a registered nurse who specializes in case management. If we could all welcome Kirsten.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone, for having me here. Ladies and gentlemen, and those in the spirit realm, because although these chairs appear to be empty, I assure you they are not. There's a vast amount of discarnates that are also here with us today, learning alongside with us. So that's also good to know. One thing before we start, because this topic of life challenges from a Spiritist perspective can really be touched on from different angles. For all intents and purposes, we're going to focus obviously from a Spiritist perspective, but also we're going to be touching on the religious, the philosophical, and scientific aspect of it as well. But just to allow this idea, before we start, to be slightly more concrete for us, I want to first bring about an idea of how the even mere words, life challenge, we already have an idea of what that means. So in order for us to sort of be open to new ideas, we must discard the old ones. So before I do that, I'm going to ask my friend Dennis in the back to do something I had spoken to him earlier about. In just a second, you'll know what I mean. But as we were sitting here today and absorbing the knowledge from one another, because in the Spirit's book, Part 3, which talks about the divine natural laws, at the end of the Law of Society, please correct me for those of you who have read that particular section if I'm wrong, but at the very end, Kardec, or close to the end, Kardec brings an idea that we need to be amongst one another, because as a single human being, myself or us, we are not yet perfect angelic beings. So we actually need one another to share ideas, to learn from one another. But in order to do that, for you to hear my perspective, you must be open to it. But some of us, whether we are conscious of this or not, we hold previous ideas, previous conceptions and notions, which sometimes can imprison us. Can imprison us to a point where it causes us pain and we don't even know it. So would you please humor me and join in this activity? I want you to take the plastic glass that was just given to you. I want you to cover one eye, and I want you to put the glass over your other eye. And I want you to look at me with that eye. Can anyone see me clearly? No. If you can answer no. Stay like that just for a moment, because I want you to feel what that feels like, because sometimes it's hard to picture that. But the way that you're looking at me right now, in some way, in some shape or form, it's the way that we look at one another and our life circumstances. You can put the glass back down. But sometimes we have that vision and we don't even realize that we have that vision until something happens that starts hitting that glass and starts hitting ideas within us, ideas that we held very true, we begin to question. And the very thing that brings this about are our life challenges. What is interesting is that there's not a single human being that has walked this earth, with the exception of Jesus in this particular time period, who was already perfect. For the rest of us, we experience trials and tribulations. If you don't believe me, well, you can do your own personal survey. And in some way, shape, or form, if you talk to people, or every single person you meet, in so many ways they've gone through something. Some people have gone through very tragic things. Some people have gone through more simple things. But everybody has endured something in their life, big or small, that either has brought them to their knees or has made them question about life. So our job today is to help us to understand life challenges and why they occur from a Spiritist perspective and how to cope with them. from a more broader perspective. Because sometimes when we look at life challenges, we have it closed. We look at life like that little glass, and we think that every time something comes and challenges us, it's a problem, and I want it out of my life. Much like when I have an ailment, I seek, naturally speaking, I seek treatment because I want to do away with it. But one thing we take away from the Spiritist knowledge is, in fact, if we were able to, for those of you who are walking in late, sorry to say you missed a wonderful presentation, and now you're just catching the end of it. But we had each person pull a small little plastic glass to their eye and cover it to simulate an idea that oftentimes we have very closed notions and perceptions about life, and we need to put that glass down. Or even if we don't willfully do so, life will bring us challenges to at least force us to move this hand at the very least, to open up a little bit. So we see in part 3 of the Spirit's book what I mentioned. And I don't want to be redundant because I know that we have talked about this numerous times, you've heard about it, but I have to stand on my soapbox and we have to say this because it is amazing. And we recommend, and it's recommended by the Spirits to go and read this because it's interesting. Let's think about it for a second. Let's look at our own society, right? When the great minds, our founding fathers of the United States of America, when it wasn't even the United States yet, John Adams and all the bunch, they came and helped to institute laws and lots of other different things because we needed structure. Human beings need structure. We need to find some way to guide us somehow. And what's interesting in part 3 of the Spirit's book is something that they say, that the Spirits tell us, that, and I'm going to read directly here, it is the only true law necessary for the happiness of human beings. So when we look at, and it's not bad, but when we look at on the internet, and you can Google, ways to find happiness, you can buy books, CDs, you can pay hundreds of dollars to attend many speakers' lectures in Hawaii or other places. People spend, it's $1 million industry. It's amazing how much people profit from it. It's amazing. When we can't help but think every time we read this in the Spirit's book, this even just this one small chapter, because obviously we recommend the entire book, but those 10 laws are fascinating. Because if you really wholeheartedly study them, you begin to find many answers to questions you never knew you had. It's an interesting thing when you find answers and you find centeredness and wholeness that you didn't even know you were without. But again, the Spirits tell us people need precise rules, we need structure, we need balance. It's not a bad thing. I know that we know that depending upon our background, we discussed here today, some people come from a very dogmatic background in Catholicism, or maybe not so dogmatic, or different notions of religions and ideas that may be affecting us today in a good or negative way. But no matter what, we need to move forward in our life. We need to find the answers, and we will. It's a natural progress of life. It's inevitable. We will get there. But something interesting we actually were discussing over lunch today is because, and this is very common, more or less, because how many people, and if you don't want to be honest, it's okay, but you can answer in your mind. When you began your spiritual journey, whether it was in Spiritism or not, or in Buddhism or in some other area of religious beliefs or spiritual beliefs, how many of you actually thought that once you started that belief system, you'd be without problems? Did anybody actually believe that? Some people do. We have heard people say, well, I thought that once I started coming to the center, or I started going to my church, it would answer all my questions. Or we even have some people come to our Spiritist Center who say, well, I thought by coming here, my problems would be solved. Boom, they'd vanish. Like it was magic. It's a great fallacy that people have in their mind. One more reason why we need to be amongst one another, to really do away with all the fallacies and false ideas we have brought with us for many lifetimes. Joanna DeAndres, in a beautiful book called Open Your Heart and Find Happiness, she completely disintegrates that idea. by this statement. She says, spiritual growth does not cease when a person dedicates himself to the conquest of the relevant values of goodness. So there are many people who join religious areas or sects or religion or societies and believe, well, I say I'm a Christian or I'm a Catholic or I'm a Buddhist. That's it. I'm good. Saved. Me, God, we're good. I don't need to do anything. I don't need to work on myself. It's actually a fallacy. It's a false idea that actually causes people a lot of pain in their life, because it's quite the contrary. It's just the beginning. Because what happens? When I embark on my spiritual journey, most of my life I've been like this. Or, better yet, I've been like this. Walking blindly, bumping into walls, wondering why I'm suffering so much. But then once you go to your respective Spiritist centers, because obviously this is a Spiritist gathering, I'm going to refer to that, or perhaps other areas, you go from perhaps like this to perhaps just this, or maybe this. An interesting idea that Joanna DeAndres brings to us is that she says that when you're in transition of this to this, or this to this, basically in essence, which means when you begin to look at your old ideas and begin to embrace new ones, a battle is forged within yourself. It's natural, in a sense, because there's the old self that you used to be, and it's the new self that you would like to be. And that's the area where in the beginners, when people say baby Christians or baby Spiritists, meaning you're in the beginning, many people get very discouraged, especially when you're already living your life like this, you add on life challenges, you give up. Some people. Not because they're not strong enough, but because their willpower isn't quite worked out very well. Let's give more a concrete example. For instance, if you're trying to lose weight, okay, you look at some thinner people and you think to yourself, oh, that'd be great to look like that. As you're eating your McDonald's, yeah, she looks really good. You go, girl. Yeah, let me go back to eating. We want to because we think it's nice. And I'm talking strictly on something that's concrete because it's an easier idea to share with you than a more abstract idea, which is sometimes more complicated. But it's something interesting. If you can manage to work enough on your willpower to say, you know what? I want to be that way. I want to be healthy. I'm not talking about a supermodel. I'm not talking about an idea that's so far-fetched where you'd be walking a runway. We're talking of just being healthy, let's say. I wish to be healthy. I wish for my cholesterol to get down. And just overall good health. So you begin to modify your behavior. Some people start out in the beginning, it's good, they're able to stick with it, and others fall off because it's difficult. Have you ever tried to modify a habit? There's different ideas out there in science. Some scientific study says, well, if you take 21 days, you can change a habit. There's other ones that say it takes 27 days to change a habit. I have a challenge for you. Take either one of those and attempt to change a habit and see how it goes. Because at the very least, if you can change the concrete, something more, I would say, easier, such as weight loss, or perhaps if you feel you gossip too much, whatever it is, work on that one thing for 1 month. After 1 month, come back to us. Send us an email. Let us know. And I guarantee you will come back and you will say, I feel stronger. My willpower is stronger. Because that is a way to really work out, to make yourself spiritually, to build moral muscle, to work on things. It's an idea I want you to take about eating and dieting, but I want you to surgically remove it into your moral life. Because we have bad habits that we've been with for many years. Many people live quite happily like this. They may encounter troubles, challenges. It doesn't bother them. They're okay with that. They bother other people around them, but it doesn't bother them. Until one day, something more challenging happens to wake them up. But God is always patient with us. Always. He never forces. He creates those laws that we discussed, that we mentioned, we referred to in part 3 of the Spirit's book. He creates those laws. They're constantly being applied. Always. They're always working. The law of cause and effect, action and reaction is always working. And that teaches us things that sometimes we're not even aware of. That's why life challenges is something interesting. It's meant to teach us. But much like the glass that's over our eyes, or incorrect perspectives, we would say, we look at life challenges as a burden, as something we want to get rid of, instead of utilizing as it should, which it is a tool for us. So a treadmill is a tool, right? For some, it's a horrible thing that they have to do, and they do it. But after a while, it becomes a tool. You get used to it. You even form a habit where it's like if you can't do it that day, you feel a little bit off. It's the same for when we create a habit of prayer in our lives, when we continue to go to our Spiritist centers, when you go on vacation and you're in a habit of praying and going to your Spiritist centers, and you go on vacation or something happens in your schedule that's beyond your power to control, you feel off. You feel strange. Anything that is out of the norm for us is strange. So part of life challenges is changing our perspective and creating new habits, as well as an emotional level. Because what's interesting, especially in working in healthcare, and maybe some of you can attest to this as well in your own respective areas where you work, but in our case, working in healthcare, I work with a population that is low income, impoverished, and lack of education runs rampant. Not because there's not necessarily resources available, but for some reason that we are not even really that sure of, because there's different research that's out there that says different conflicting things. But it seems to be a prevalence of drug addiction, sexual abuse that goes on in this particular section of people. Again, and no judgments, just stating the facts of where we work. But it's interesting because as we've observed over the last number of years, the unbelievable personal challenges that these patients endure because of their own negative habits is amazing. And yet they continuously do the same thing repetitively. We have alcoholics that will drink themselves into cirrhosis. They will go into the hospital and they'll just bleed, because when you affect your liver, you cause bleeding problems. Will be vomiting up blood. They get discharged, they get stabilized, and we find them down the street at the local bar 2 weeks later. Sometimes you drive by and you see Jimmy, oh, there goes Jimmy, I'll see you in a week when you get to the hospital. It has reached that level where it's comical. It has. But that brings me to my next point. And that brings us to actually two next points, is that Spiritism is not here to combat necessarily social misery. Because let us tell you, there is at least in Baltimore where I work, there is an amazing amount of resources, especially downtown Baltimore. You wouldn't believe that exists for people with mental illness, with who have been sexually abused, for addicts. There is so much, and amazing people, truly, that I've met who want to help people. So if it's not the resources that are not available to them, what keeps us from overcoming these particular life challenges that, by the way, we cause? The lack of a desire to want to change. Their particular willpower has not been structured. They have not worked on it enough to want to change and modify their behavior. In the Gospel according to Spiritism, Kardec says the following, and we're going to paraphrase. He says the majority of our pain and suffering has two main causes. And you can find various more specific ones and subcategories and such, but for our intents of this talk, we're going to just mention two. He says it's the ones basically that must happen, that's ordained in your reincarnatory plan, and then there are those that we cause ourselves. So, the first ones that we sort of have to go through because it's a learning process. Sometimes we're born poor, sometimes we're born rich, because we need to experience different things. But much like some of the patients we encounter, who drink themselves into an alcoholic stupor or do other types of destructive behavior, they make that decision. Now you could say, Kirsten, well, what about they grew up with an alcoholic father and, they were abandoned and molested? All those things play a part as well. But each creature of God is never left without help. Each one of us. Did you know that you have your own personal trainer? How many of you would love to have like Oprah Winfrey's personal trainer that she has and personal chef at home? I don't know about you guys, but I think I would like it. We would like it because it's nice. Did you know you already have one? You do. You have a personal trainer who's actually sent by God, chosen by God, specifically just for you. Did you guys know that? It's your guardian angel who is there to assist you through all of your life struggles, through all of your problems, free of charge, non-judgmental, and whether it's 3 a.m. in the morning or it's, midday, they're willing to help you as long as you are willing to be helped. All of us included. It's a beautiful, comforting thing for us to think about that, because oftentimes when we're going through life challenges, we have this perspective, or we have 2 cups, or our eyes are completely covered. Because sometimes we have the wrong perspectives, and that's why it's important to be here with one another, discussing things. Just because we stand at a podium does not mean that we have mastered all the things that we are showing to you on the screen. No, actually, we learn a lot more by teaching, because we study and we converse, and we become sort of energized with the teachings. It's amazing. We see the conversations we've had here today have been very invigorating. That one-on-one contact with one another is pretty amazing. We talked about this role of perspective and how important it plays in our struggle, our life struggles. In the Gospel According to Spiritism, page 42, it's a very interesting quote. I'm going to read it directly. Generally, humans see only the present. However, if suffering is useful for their future happiness, God will allow them to suffer, just as a surgeon allows a sick person to suffer an operation that should bring healing. Forgive me if I'm wrong. I do believe this is the message from La Cordère, a spirit that came through, and I believe, I don't have it on the screen, it was instructions from the spirits. I'm going to give you an example of what the spirit is talking about. There's an amazing book that if you have not read it yet, please read it. It's now in English, so now you have no excuse. It's called Memoirs of a Suicide by a prolific and amazing medium who's no longer incarnate. Her name is Ivani Pereira. And at that time, the book was written and psychographed before Nos Solar was psychographed. And she held on to this particular book. It's not on the screen, I'm pointing, but it's not there. She held on to it for years without publishing it for numerous reasons that I'm not going to tell you, because you have to read the introduction of the book and you'll find out. But there's a case in that book, and it's not the ending, so I won't ruin it for you. But it's a case of a suicide, of course. The book details many lives of suicides. A case of a suicide, and this particular suicide, he already had been rescued. He had been going to a spiritual colony to receive assistance with other spirits that were also previous suicides. So what happens? Well, lo and behold, they have universities in the spirit realm. Ah, very interesting. Who's the first people to really create universities? It's spirit realm, and then we manifest it here, right? So the university is very interesting, because when we went to nursing school, and probably if you went to some type of schooling, different ways, usually you have what's called theory, and then you have the practicum, where you study in the book, and then you have to practice hands-on. Engineers have this, nurses, doctors, lawyers, all have this. So, lo and behold, that also exists in the spirit realm. So, for a number of semesters, him, along with other suicides, studied theories of understanding of spirituality, God, and knowledge. Well, now comes the practicum. Except this practicum is much more interesting because the professor is a highly more elevated and morally upright. In this particular practicum, he calls the suicide to the stage or to the front. You can imagine he's trembling, and he kind of is like, "Oh, I don't think I want to tell my story." He tries to get out of it, but the professor says, "No, you must come." So he says, "Okay, my name is such and such. I committed suicide, but hallelujah, I am good now because I've accepted this knowledge and I'm wonderful." And the professor said, that's not what I asked you. I want you to tell me about your suicide. What brought you to that point. So he kept trying to meander around a bush, and the professor basically, in his moral authority, kind of made him tell his story. So he told his story of how his previous life, this most recent incarnation where he took his life, he was born into a poor family, but he managed to get a good job as a banker, so he was okay. In his 30s, he met the love of his life, absolute love of his life, except there was a problem. He actually came to find out that he had tongue and throat cancer. And out of desperation, he realized, well, I'm poor. I don't have the money for chemotherapy or the drugs that they want me to do. He's like, well, I work at a bank. I'm going to steal money from the bank and for my own treatment, because he rationalized it out and said, well, I have cancer, I don't have money, so that's what I did. But then he said, by the time I realized what I had done, I was so knee-deep in my problems that I knew I was going to get caught and go to jail and shame my life, that I decided to take it instead. And he said, with tears in his eyes, I don't understand why I was born poor, why I got cancer, and right when I met the love of my life, and I was gonna start this beautiful life, that I got tongue and throat cancer, or more specifically tongue cancer. Why? Why me? A question we often either ask in our minds or towards one another at some point in our existence. The professor turned to him and said, I'm going to show you in front of all of your pupils why you suffered. So there, he regressed him back to a previous life about a century ago, I would say. In the book it says, if I'm sorry if it's not the exact date. He regresses him back to about the 1800s sometime, when slavery was going on. And then the actual previous suicide, he begins detailing his life and starts explaining. I'm living in this particular area, I believe it was Brazil, or he lived in Portugal, migrated to Brazil, and he's into slave trafficking. He's a very wealthy man and makes a lot of money. But he's not only a slave trafficker, he abuses them so profoundly that on one particular day, doing his normal abusive activities, there's no children in the room now, he rapes a young lady who in the book, the spirit, Camilo, shares that she's barely leaving her childhood and entering adolescence, brutally rapes her in such a way that afterwards she's so shamed that she kills herself. And her father, in desperation, turns to this slave owner and says, you are a horrible man. I detest you, and starts yelling at him. The slave owner says, oh, okay. He tells the other slaves to come and to cut off his tongue. Actually, not cut off, excuse me, burn his tongue. It's probably, each one is equally bad. To such an extent where that slave dies in a painful agony. As they're telling this particular previous suicide comes back to his current state, and he's sobbing profusely. And you know what he says? That's not me. I couldn't have done that. How could I have done that? I don't understand. What lies in the unconscious is amazing. You never know what we have done, and thankfully for God's allows us to forget what we have done, we're able to live. But for all intents and purposes, we can see now that every challenge and restriction, we would say, in our life, which oftentimes is deemed a challenge, like this particular man, why did he get tongue cancer? According to law of cause and effect, action and reaction, he had to pay back what he had done. In that incarnation, through the mercy of our great Creator, what he really deserved also was for his tongue to be burned, but since God is merciful, he just allowed him to get tongue cancer to help purify himself. And the fact that he was born poor was because in a previous life, he abused the riches with lavish things. I'm not going to tell you how the rest of this story goes, but I recommend you bring some tissues when you read the book. It is extremely moving. If you ever want to know how God's laws work, you can read that book. Although the book Action and Reaction is amazing and basically details an internship that Andrea Louise does along with a friend Ilario in a colony called Manson-Paz. They tell beautiful stories, but that particular book, Memoirs of a Suicide, is like Action and Reaction times 10 or 1,000,000. It's an amazing story if you want it to touch your heart. Because it's something interesting that Joanna DeAngelis has taught us over the years of studying her books along with other Spiritist books, is she says that it's not enough for you, for us, to read and know the Spirit's book, the Gospel, Heaven and Hell, the Medium's book in Genesis, back to back, from cover to cover, to know it by heart, to be able to spat off a verse out of chapter 5, item 13, and know it quick. That's not enough, she says. Not only must you absorb it into your mind, live it, not only must we absorb it into our mind, I'm paraphrasing, and live it, but you must feel this knowledge. That's why we brought the concrete idea of the cup over the eye, because I wanted you to feel a little bit about this idea. How do we come to feel these ideas? Life challenges oftentimes. When you lose a loved one, life calls you to make a decision. Either you can be obedient with resignation and to realize this is part of the process of growing, utilize it as a tool to allow for your own spiritual growth, or you can rebel. And you can look up to God and say, God, I don't agree. Because in essence, when we are rebellious, you're basically telling God, you don't know what you're doing. Thank you. In essence, although we don't consciously try to say that, who really says that to God, but in essence, that's what we're saying. Very interesting research, though, because science is very interested in knowing why certain sects of people, different areas in different countries and different societies, why certain groups or even certain people are able to overcome situations and others are not. So over the years, of course, I couldn't put all the research that was here because probably I could spend 50 minutes talking about all the research that exists on life challenges, resilience, how to overcome things. But for the purpose of this talk, we just brought one idea, which is interesting because we can bridge it most easily with Spiritism. It's the idea of resilience. This idea is woven very strongly into what the Gospel according to Spiritism, there's a chapter on obedience and resignation. Resilient people are more obedient and resign themselves. They flow better because what is the definition of a resilient person? It's an ability to recover from or adjust easily to misfortune or change. That is in part when we are able to be obedient and resign to the things that happen to us in our lives. We can sort of go with it in a sense. We learn to bend rather than to break. And that phrase is oftentimes used at marriage seminars when they always tell you, oh, it's better to bend than to break, compromise rather than to throw it all away. It's true, it's applicable here. It's better to learn to work with things than to give up entirely. I'm going to talk about a research in a second, but one of the things within the research that says that they found about people who go through traumatic experiences, difficult hardships, were actually found to have very specific traits. Now, scientists said we're not sure if this is what makes them resilient, but this is what these people had, and they were the ones who overcame their problems, who were still happy, jovial, even after their problems had occurred. They were people who were considered to be resilient, tend to be very flexible, adaptable, and optimistic. They seem more capable of withstanding what others might perceive as tremendously stressful. Resilient or hardy people possess characteristics that appear to allow them more ease as they go through life. And I put the source website there if you're interested. But what's interesting is a true case I'll try to go through briefly because of time that I experienced. Allow me to tell this story from a personal note. On a personal note, I used to work in a medical ICU in Pennsylvania for 4 years, and 4 of those years I worked a woman who was our secretary just for our floor. She was miserable. I hope she is not anymore. But she was miserable. People knew her as a person. We'll call her Mary. Everybody knew her. People tried to avoid her, and she would always have something negative to say about everything. She was the embodiment of pessimism, and she lived that. But it's very interesting because we began to take it as a challenge in our life. So one day, we had the opportunity to sit down and talk with Mary about her life. And she began telling us the following story. Mary is about 62 years old, at least at the time she was. 36 years prior, she met the love of her life. They were passionate about each other. They planned to get married. Their marriage was all set. Everything was set up. A week before the wedding, her fiance came to her, sat her down, and said, Mary, I love you very much, but I'm sorry to have to tell you, I'm in love with your sister. We have to call off the wedding. She didn't have any words, she said. I was devastated, she said. And her sister and her fiance moved to a different state, got married, and at that point in time, when she told me they had had children, but she never spoke to her sister again. And she blamed that one moment, or that period of time in her life, to explain all the misery she experienced the rest of her life, from that point onward. And she said, that's why, probably you know, I'm a miserable person. But what we saw instead was a person who was hurt, and said by a very wise man whose name for the life of me I cannot remember, and I shall tell you later. He was a lawyer and a family therapist. But he said something, it's a very short phrase that has stuck in my head like a bad song you wish would get out of your head. But he said, hurt people hurt people. Our perspectives play a big role in our life. And so does our spirituality. Because science also has shown that people who were this more resilient, adaptable, and optimistic sometimes would go to their faith. They were faith believers that helped them to be more optimistic, to change their perspectives. What's interesting is this last research I'll share with you and run through it quickly. This research on Holocaust victims, and they found that a lot of the Holocaust victims who survived were very resilient. They studied them and found, because initially they had thought that people who go through traumatic experiences live shorter lives. They have shorter lifespans, science said. But what they were fascinated by was that actually they found that people, especially the people who went through the Holocaust, they lived longer. Male survivors lived up to 18 months longer than Jewish peers who were not confined to concentration camps during the war. Again, bringing us to this idea that life challenges can serve as a purpose, as a tool in our life. We can discuss that more later. But I want to leave you with this, tips to manage our struggle. Do not underestimate the power of prayer in your life. It is an amazing tool. God will grant you CPR. I'm just going to briefly tell you what it means. Courage, patience, and resignation. The Spirit's book, he tells us that. CPR, he will resuscitate you when you are down. If you don't believe me, just try it a couple of times and let me know how you do. But for some people, prayer is not a habit. We need to create a habit, and as much as if you want to eat healthy, lose weight, be healthy, you got to create the habit of that. Remember I told you about the 27 days? Try that and see if it works for you. I guarantee you it'll make a difference in your life. More specifically, if you begin to create a new habit of praying on a daily basis, if you go without a day without doing it, you feel different, a not so good feeling. Resignation and obedience, learning how to suffer well. Chapter 5 in the Gospel according to Spiritism, please go and read it. Specifically number 18, it teaches us how to suffer well, an idea that I don't know exists in any other paradigm anywhere in society. Even the words suffer well sounds weird. But learning how to deal with your life challenges, in modern day terms, I would say, it's amazing. Charitable acts. Science has already proven something that Jesus in the Spiritist literature has been saying for centuries. It is good to be good. Because this is a Spiritist lecture, a Spiritist topic, conversation, I cannot leave you without this. You have within your own Spiritist center, society, the tools to assist you. One of which is something we refer to as fraternal assistance. I'll briefly go through it and we can talk about it more in depth later. But these are discarnate spirits, these are the mentors, and these are the incarnates. So when you go to your prospective or respective Spiritist center to talk to someone about maybe your problems or issues, well, guess what? When you go to your fraternal assistance private encounter with one of the directors, this is actually what goes on, the behind the scenes. The spirit mentors are already there assisting you, inspiring this particular director to give you comforting words. It's amazing. And we don't charge for this. The resources we have available are immense. Also, the passes, pass givers. Here again we could see the spirit pass givers that assist, and here the incarnates. There's a chapter in the book Missionaries of the Light. It's towards the end. I believe it's the 30th chapter. Forgive me if it's not the exact chapter. It could be 19 or 18, but it's entitled Passes. It goes into depth. Beautiful if you want to understand the mechanism, but our talk is no more time to discuss that. Last but not leastly is the spiritually magnetized water. You can go to your Spiritist center, bring your jar of water if you want. Sometimes they already have water there to give you to drink. But these are the spirit mentors, doctors, physicians that come and spiritually magnetize the water specific to whatever it is that you're going through in your life. Perhaps an ailment, whatever it is, but they place within it what you specifically need. We have lots of resources around us. Like the example I gave of the alcoholics that I deal with, the patients that I deal with, and that when they want to get better, they'll get better. The same is for us. The resources are there. They're all around us. We just need to ask, we need to pray, we need to look for them. Because God never gives us anything that we cannot deal with in our lives. I know that sounds redundant because everybody says that. But it is the truth. It's meant for a tool for us to look inside of ourselves, to redress past errors we don't even remember. Because ultimately, we are created for happiness. Can you imagine yourself like ecstatic, happy, and perfect? Can you imagine that? It's hard to imagine that, right? We barely can imagine ourselves in a better, let's say, more concrete idea, working at a better place. Even for that, it's hard to imagine. It's hard to imagine not having difficulties in our life. But we were created to one day become perfect. That is the ultimate goal, and for us to be happy. So eventually, we will get there. But we can get there sooner if we utilize the resources that exist within our very own reach. I wanted to thank you for putting up with me during this time period, and God bless us all.